Today we're talking about the end of the revolution. How does it finally end? So we left off last week talking about the Battle of Yorktown and the British surrender. And so we see this stamp from 1931 commemorating the three people that were the leaders that we see at the Battle of Yorktown, right? The main officers and commanders. We have Rochambeau, that represents the French army. We have Washington representing the Continental Army. And we have de Grasse also representing the French Navy. And those three are critical part of the war. And of course, there's so many other officers below them. There's the thousands of people that were below them, the paid soldiers, the Minutemen, the militia, the families, the women, the children, enslaved people, free people, Native Americans. There's so many people that when we talk about what happened, how we got to the surrender at Yorktown, it's really so many people, more than just three. So we're going to look at what happens after the surrender. How do we know, when is the war officially over? Like, does it officially end then? What happens after the surrender, right? The overall effects of the American Revolution. And we're going to answer that essential question that we've been talking about each week. How were they able to do this? How did this happen? All right, so let's go back to 1781. And just to give you an idea of some of the people that were there. So you have the three big people I mentioned just earlier. You have John Hancock, Paul Revere, Nathaniel Greene, Marquis de Lafayette. You're going to have Alexander Hamilton is there. There's so many people, so many famous names that we can study. James Monroe is going to be there. That we could just spend, a whole class section just talking about the people. And that's not really what we're here for today. We're looking at the big idea. How was the whole war won? And the war was won because of these people who risked their lives and thousands of others who risked their lives to stand up for an ideal, to say that the King of England, the government of England, was not representing their individual rights. The rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, as it's written. And these come from Enlightenment ideas. These come from the English Bill of Rights, where English citizens knew that they were protected by law and that they should have representation in government. And so that's where this ideal comes from, is that what the government was doing wrong and they were going to stand up for their rights. So the stamp commemorating the Battle of Yorktown. Of course, without the French Navy, it never would have been a win with that blockade. And terrible casualties on the British side. All right. Fortunately for the British, most of them were captured. Most of them were taken as prisoners. And so you would hope as a prisoner that you were going to, at the end of the war, be released. And we'll talk about that. All right, so being captured didn't mean that you were killed. It meant that you were going to be held as prisoner of war. In fact, there were many American patriots who had been captured by the British and actually held prisoner in ships in New York City harbor. And there were some pretty bad conditions there. None of the prisoner of war camps are good. But there's a few stories about, and there's actually a monument in New York City to the people on the prisoner of war ships that the British held them at. They really didn't have a place to put them. All right, so let's fast forward to 1783. So the surrender means just that. It means no more fighting. The fighting is going to stop. But you still have British soldiers, British troops, British officers. You still have loyalists and you still have patriots living in this now free place. And so how do you handle that? How do you create a new world from that? Well, it's going to end at the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So just be mindful as you study history, the many treaties have been signed in France, in Paris. And so we always want to include the year with it because the year helps us identify, Treaty of Paris, 1783, that's the one that ends the American Revolution. Right? And so here you have signers at the treaty signing in Paris. And this is the portrait that stamp was based on. And if you notice, It's not finished. It's not finished because the British ambassadors who were representing Britain at the treaty signing refused to sit for the portrait. So you have the 5 men that represent the United States sitting for the portrait, and you can even see some of them. It's not finished. We have the documents on the table. One of them, I believe, is James Monroe in the back, is really taken from an older painting, but we don't have the British ambassadors because they refused to sit for the painting. All right, this is a photo of the actual signed portion of the Treaty of Paris. It's a few pages long, right? And here we see Hartley, John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay. And so that's their signatures and their seals. And you see the word treaty up in big letters, and that it was done at Paris. Okay. And that's the official signing of it. So that is held in the National Archives in the United States. So what happens in this treaty? The treaty has 10 different sections to it. And one of the key sections, now in the classroom, you're going to, on your Google Forms, I've actually printed out the different articles within the treaty, and you can examine each one of those, the key ones. But this is the first article. Britain acknowledges the United States of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence plantations. So there were 2 colonies. There was the colony of Rhode Island, there was the colony of Providence. Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay, there is no West Virginia at this point. It is still Virginia. So it's a much larger colony than the Virginia state is today. Right? And says that they will be free, sovereign, meaning that they can self-govern themselves, and independent. Now, this is important. So in the treaty, they're named as the United States. But this also acknowledges each one of these colonies, now states, to be individual as a separate nation. And this leads into what's going to be the first constitution for the United States, the Articles of Confederation. It's not the current U.S. Constitution. These states, new states, become very independent. There is no main army. There is no president of the United States. There is no United States currency or money. Different states can make their own money. And so this is going to cause a lot of problems down the road, which will be fixed with the second U.S. Constitution, which is the one that's been in effect now. Okay. And so now you have 13 independent states that have a similar background and culture. This is not the United States government the way it's set up now, with a main Congress and a president and a Supreme Court, the 3 branches of government. That does not exist yet at this point in the United States. So where is the United States? Right? If we look at a map, we have British Canada to the north, that they took in the French-Indian War, that is one of the main causes for the American Revolution. The stars are going to be where we have our 13 colonies that started out. And now the United States will go from the Atlantic Ocean on the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River, all the way west to the Mississippi River, which brings up a question: what's going to happen to those Native Americans? That's a whole other class. And part of the treaty says that Great Britain and the United States will share the Mississippi River for trade purposes, for hunting purposes, for fishing purposes. France will claim back New Orleans in Louisiana and up into that Midwest part, because remember, France's major ally, Spain, is going to maintain the lands of New Spain. That includes Florida, and it includes what's now Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California. All of that land is going to still be underneath Spanish control. All right. The other thing that the peace treaty does is it brings peace. It brings an absolute peace. There's no what ifs. There's no maybes. It ends any purpose in fighting. So any fighting that would break out between a patriot and a loyalist in the now United States would be wrong. That would have to be taken up within the local courts. There's no reason for fighting amongst themselves. Another thing that the peace treaty did is it said that all of the property that the patriots had confiscated during the revolution should be returned to any loyalists. That would include their land, their slaves, the property, anything within the home, any documents, all of that should be returned. Many of these were taken over as soon as 1776. A lot of the land was taken over. People were taken over. A lot of the people that were loyal to England actually left their homes for fear of their lives and went to live in the nearest city. So it would be Philadelphia in the Middle Colonies. It's going to be, first it was Boston, and it's going to be New York City, and also Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. So in those big port cities, you're going to have loyalists that are basically refugees. They've left their homes, they've come to these cities. The English have control of these major cities during the course of the revolution, and they're offering protection to anyone who needs it. So once the treaty is signed, one of the conditions of the treaty is that it has to be ratified within 6 months. So when something is ratified, it means that a government gives formal approval to it. Today, to ratify something in the United States, it takes a 3/5 majority vote. It is not an agreement, it's a voting to accept an agreement. Right. So if something is ratified, it's voted with a yes vote. So you either give a yes vote or a no vote. So what happened to those people who were loyal to the British government? Right. Many people had to figure out, if you were a loyalist and you've been a refugee, you've been living in Philadelphia or New York City or Charleston or Savannah, and you're wondering, what is your life going to be like with this new government? Over 29,000 refugees actually left just New York City alone. Many thousand more left other cities. Some were pushed and some were pulled. So what do we mean by that? That's a really important social studies term. To be pushed means it's negative. You don't want to go. Something's making you go. If you're pulled, that's more like a magnet. You're attracted to something, you want to go. All right. So some people were pushed because they feared violence. They feared that they had been living in, say, New York City, and what was your farmland going to be like? Was your house even going to be there? Had the Patriots burned it? Had all of your livestock been taken? Had your farmland been ruined? And so many people said, it's not worth going back. I don't want to go back to a community where I'm not wanted, where I don't feel that the people trust me. And so people were often pushed for fear, right? And a lot of the places where they went, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Canada, that's all controlled by the British. And many people went to Jamaica. Jamaica was the largest British colony in the Caribbean. And especially loyalists who had been in the southern colonies, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, they were looking to continue that business of owning a plantation, owning land, having slaves, growing a cash crop, doing that as a profitable business. So many people went to Jamaica. Some people also went to the Bahamas. And so those two islands took in a lot of people. Some people were pulled there. Some people said, this is going to be good for me. And one of the reasons some people were pulled is that the British government actually offered them compensation. You could file a claim with the British government if you had lost your property or your home. They were offering people farm tools and seeds if you were moving, especially into Canada, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. They were offering clothes to you. So Maybe you've left much of your clothes behind, or maybe you had original, excuse me, lived in Boston. So maybe you lived in Boston and it was cooler climate, and now you're going to be living in the Bahamas or Jamaica, and so you need warm weather clothes, or vice versa. Maybe you came from a southern colony and you're moving to Nova Scotia or Canada, and you're going to need some warm, cold weather clothes. Those things were offered to them. Transportation was offered to the people. So there was an opportunity to start over, to have a new life. And so some people were very wealthy, had money in banks, and they could afford to do that. Other people were the farmers with small families, and they decided this was just another opportunity for them to benefit. All right. Now, what about the enslaved people? Because during the war, Britain offered that enslaved people could come join up with the British forces, and in return, they'd be guaranteed their freedom. Now, the Virginia governor is the first one who offered this, and then it spread throughout the colonies. So, about 20,000 people, and we're talking men, women, and children, sometimes men with their families would come, took the opportunity. About 8,000 to 10,000, so almost half of them, if not half of them, died during the war. Uh, the war was not easy. Many died from malnutrition, from disease. These were people, the enslaved people who joined up with the British Army, were fighting in the regiments, some. Most were laborers or servants, some unpaid. Some were craftsmen, like blacksmiths and barrel makers, coopers, wheelwrights, people that they needed in the British Army to keep things moving. Some served as cooks, some women and children served as laundresses. And so while there was a place for them, it doesn't mean that they were treated fairly and that they were paid a salary for joining. What they were given, though, is their freedom. So the British did keep their promise there, and about 8,000 to 10,000 emancipated black colonials just from New York and Charleston by November of 1783, which was basically, that was move out day. Okay. And so they were put on ships. Many went to Nova Scotia, some went to more eastern Florida, the Caribbean. Many went to Nova Scotia, and it was very, very hard living in Nova Scotia. They were not accepted by the people that were there. Some people went back to parts of West Africa and tried to resettle there. Uh, it was a hard life. I've read some of the diaries, I've read some of the stories, and it was not like, hey, let's start a new life. It was a really hard life. They were not taken in, they were shunned for the most part by other citizens that were already there. All right. Now, Article 7 of the Peace Treaty said that they were supposed to be returned to their slaveholders, and the British refused to do that. If they were somebody who had actually signed up, were documented as being with the British forces, they had the choice and they were allowed to leave. In fact, the last British ship leaving New York City was full of black people who had been formerly enslaved. So November 25th, 1783 is the official evacuation day, at least for New York City. Remember, New York City had been held by the British since Washington had retreated back in 1775. All right, so this is a big day. Washington comes parading in down Main Street of New York City, and it's tremendous. Flags are going up. The British flags are being taken down. They're seeing the British ships leave. It was at noon that the transfer was to take place. And New York City becomes the new capital of the United States. Now, Washington goes on to resign. That's November 25th, not even a month later. He resigns as leader of the Continental Army. And so this is going to bring in, remember, he was hired as commander-in-chief. He has not been elected president, and so he resigns his commission as commander-in-chief. There is no president of the United States. It's more of a cabinet or directorship. And so Washington is well known, and probably one of the reasons he's well known as a good president, a good leader, is this was part of his speech. He said, "I've now finished the work assigned me. I retire from the great theater of action." Right? Bid a farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted. I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life. And his goal was then to return to his plantation on Mount Vernon and live the life of a wealthy farmer. So this is Mount Vernon. Now, if you've ever studied much about George Washington, he was a slaveholder. His wife was a slaveholder. In fact, there's a story that one of his slaves, one of the women, had seen some British ships. She heard about the fact that you could join the British forces. She escapes with some other slaves from Mount Vernon. They managed to get on the ship. George Washington's cousin, who had been left in charge of Mount Vernon while he was commanding the Continental Army, goes to the ship's captain when it comes into harbor and says, "Those are my slaves. They're the slaves of Mount Vernon. They need to come back. I'll even make you a deal." And so the British captain cleverly says, "Well, we could use some supplies. We don't have any fresh food." So he goes and gets some supplies, and the British captain takes the supplies and laughs at him. He doesn't return them. There is a record that George Washington actually contacted some British officials saying, "Could we privately just pull the ship aside and get my slaves off of there?" So this was definitely an area of contention. It was another reason, remember, why some of the Loyalists are moving on with their lives, is because they would have to start over, and starting over would mean for many of them buying new slaves. That's a great cost. All right. Now, just looking back, we talk about how did they win. This is the French General Rochambeau's review of the army when he first met them in New York. "I had a chance to see the American army man for man. It was really painful to see these brave men, almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets, most of them without stockings. But, would you believe it? Cheerful and healthy in appearance. 3/4 of the Rhode Island regiment consists of Negroes, and that regiment is the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, and the most precise in their maneuvers." So I think that I like this quote because, one, it tells you that these were truly mostly farmers who were joining up to fight, right? But they had the motivation to win. It also shows you the importance of every person, Black, white, Native American, who helped to get that win, helped to defeat the British Army. It was not any one group of people. It was a total win with so many people. And I'll have a separate video on the Native Americans. Many Americans fought gallantly in support of the Patriots. Sadly, the new American government was not as honorable as the British government in keeping their word on how they would treat people at the end of the war. So, how do they win? How do you defeat the largest army? Because you keep going, because you persevere. You also have the home court advantage, right? They knew where they were. You also have allies that bring you what you need. They bring the ships, they bring supplies, they bring silver, they bring morale boosters. You have other Europeans like von Steuben who come in and drill the soldiers so that they can fight better. You have Casimir Pulaski, who's Polish, and he comes and he builds a cavalry and starts using that as a means to outwit. You have people like Francis Marion the Swamp Fox. You have people like James Lafayette and Samuel Poor, who are Black people who decide to join up, and because they are thought of as less than on both sides, they make excellent spies. And so it's the women behind, the women who kept the farms, the women who fought on the front lines when their husbands could, the women who left their children behind, the children who did without their parents to survive. All of that leads to the win. So it's a win for many. And it's also a loss for many. So we always have to keep in mind that while the outcome of war on paper may look great, there's also a lot of loss of life. And um, for many Americans, they trace their ancestry back to the revolution to say that, hey, my people have been here, because America is, other than anyone who's Native American, everyone else came to America, right? They migrated here, whether they were pushed, as enslaved people were, and indentured servants were, or if they were pulled because they saw it as an opportunity. And so that also is, why did they win? Because they saw it as a land of opportunity. And for many, that idea still exists today.